my sister made a dive at me, and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, "You come along and be dosed." Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative, that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat, for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm, as a boot would be held in a bootjack. Joe got off with half a pint, but was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance, as he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly had a turn afterwards, if he had had none before. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his, united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I heard the voice outside of the man with the iron on his leg who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must be fed now. At other times, I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbruing his hands in me, should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight, instead of tomorrow. If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then. But, perhaps, nobody's ever did. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day, with a copper stick, from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable. Happily, I slipped away, and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. "Hark," said I, when I had done my stirring, and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed, "was that great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said, snappishly, "Escaped." Escaped, administering the definition like tar water, while Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework. I put my mouth into the forms of saying to Joe, "What's a convict?" Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a highly elaborate answer that I could make out nothing of it but the single word, "Pip." "There was a convict off last night," said Joe, aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired warning of him. And now? It appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. Drat that boy, interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. What a questioner he is. Ask no questions, and you'll be told no lies. It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions. But she never was polite, unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide, and to put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe, and put my mouth into the form of saying, her. But Joe wouldn't hear of that, at all, and again opened his mouth very wide, and shook the form of a most emphatic word out of it. But I could make nothing of the word. Mrs. Joe, said I, as a last resort, I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from. Lord bless the boy, exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. From the hulks. O.H., said I, looking at Joe. Hulks. Joe gave a reproachful cough, as much as to say, well, I told you so. And please what's hulks, said I. That's the way with this boy, exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread, and shaking her head at me. Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right, crossed meshes. We always use that name for marshes, in our country.